You're listening to Foreseeable, a production of Global is Asian, the flagship thought leadership digital platform of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Each episode, we invite an expert for a conversation relating to their field of study or experience and to find out what they foresee happening in the future. Assistant Professor Tan Su Jie Cheng primarily uses microeconometrics techniques combined with economic modeling to conduct empirical research in the areas of environment, health, and development. Recently, he and his co-authors published an article titled Using Cost-Benefit Analyses to Identify Key Opportunities in Demand-Side Mitigation. Their study examines how different environmentally friendly behaviors, such as switching to public transportation or using reusable bags, impact people's well-being in Beijing, China. They assess both the financial and non-financial effects of these behaviors using cost-benefit analysis. The findings highlight which actions are beneficial or detrimental to individuals and society and identify opportunities for targeted policy interventions. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tan. Could you start by just giving me a little bit of background of what question were you trying to answer when you began this study, when you were formulating it?
Thank you, David. I guess basically came down to the observation that there are a lot of things that individuals can do to reduce their carbon footprint. But then the question is, why is it that a lot of people are not doing them? Is it lack of knowledge or is it some other reasons? As an economist, my hypothesis is that it could be that a lot of these behaviors are detrimental to people's welfare because it actually costs resources to change behaviors. And I wanted to study or examine if this is indeed the case, that by adopting this kind of low carbon lifestyle, it would actually reduce people's welfare. So that was the question that I was trying to answer.
Is that why you decided to choose a cost-benefit analysis as your primary methodology?
Right. So because I'm a trained economist, I've been trained to think in terms of monetary terms. And so in that sense, cost-benefit analysis seems to be the most natural approach to take in this case.
Can you tell us, what does demand-side mitigation actually mean? And what motivated you to study demand-side mitigation and why specifically in Beijing?
Demand-side mitigation is actually an often overlooked part of climate mitigation. For a long time, policies have been targeted at firms, at factories, trying to get producers to change their behaviors or to change their production techniques or to change the kind of energy that they use from high carbon fossil fuel type to renewables. But demand side focuses more on the consumer's part, more on the individual's part, because a lot of our behaviors actually emits greenhouse gas directly or indirectly. So demand-side mitigation basically focuses on what consumers, what individuals can do to change their behaviors so that we can reduce our carbon footprint. And the idea behind this research actually came about when I was having a conversation with an NUS colleague. He's an ecologist. So, he was telling me demand-side mitigation has been studied quite extensively in the ecological or biological space. But what they did back then was mostly focused on the emissions mitigation potential, meaning how effective is this particular behavior in reducing your footprint. There was this really famous study back, I think, published in 2017. And one of their headline findings were, to really reduce our carbon footprint, the most effective thing you can do is to have one less kid, is to have one less child. So when this colleague told me about this finding, back in my head, I was thinking, I really don't think people are not having kids because they care about their carbon footprint. It could be because it's more welfare enhancing for them to not have kids. So that's got me started thinking, perhaps a lot of these demand-side mitigation behaviors, what it boils down to is really about our welfare or how our welfare will be affected before we decide whether we want to engage in that. And so that's what led me down this rabbit hole of this study.
And then you took 12 different behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. 12 different things that could be anything from switching from private vehicles to public transportation, maybe switching from a combustion engine vehicle to a battery electric vehicle, or also things like just turning off the lights in every room, switching from an animal protein diet to tofu or to a plant-based meat, or even things like switching from plastic bags to reusable bags for shopping. And then you looked at what you call the pecuniary components and the non-pecuniary components. And the pecuniary are basically the economic part.
Yes, the monetary part. Yeah.
Then for the non-pecuniary components, you talk about things like time, psychological discomfort, and attention costs. Can you explain a little bit about how you conceptualize those, and then did you put a monetary value to them? Give us a little bit of a framework of how you viewed those costs.
Absolutely. Now, the one thing about cost-benefit analysis is that everything needs to be expressed in a common unit. And the unit we use is the dollar sign. A lot of costs, a lot of benefits have dollar signs, but a lot of other costs and other benefits don't have dollar signs, but they are still important. So this is what we term as non-pecuniary. Time is one of them, because in some of these behaviors, for instance, switching from private to public transport, sure, it will save you a lot of money. You don't have to own a car anymore. You don't have to pay for fuel or parking or whatnot. Obviously, the cost of public transportation, at least monetary-wise, is much, much smaller than private transportation. But the trade-off is you're going to spend a lot of time traveling. And this time is a cost, it's a resource, right, for the individual. So then the question is, how do we value something like time? Fortunately, in environmental economics, we have actually devised a lot of methods over the years to monetize these seemingly impossible to monetize attributes. So for instance, time, we will use things like wage rate. Time equals money. How much money you can make if you are productive instead of spending time on the public transport. Wage rate is a very natural substitute to value time. Some other things that's more difficult to value, for example, attention costs. Say the attention cost of turning off the lights when you leave a room. Not a lot of intuitive substitutes. So in that particular instance, what we did was we ask ourselves, what is the technological substitute for that? So fortunately, there are some devices that will automatically sense whether there's someone in the room. And if there's not, the light will turn off by itself. Mm-hmm. So we use the cost of those technological substitutes as a proxy for attention costs. Because the idea is if people absolutely don't want to pay attention to that, then they can always use those technological substitutes to adopt this behavior as well. So essentially, it's a very creative mix of trying to find appropriate substitutes that can cater to these non-pecuniary costs or benefits that we are thinking about.
Mm-hmm. And what about discomfort? What did you use for that? You must have been very creative for that one.
I think that was mostly for public transportation. The idea of switching from private to public transportation has a pretty long history of research. So fortunately, we were able to find some studies that were conducted in some other settings, not in China, not in Beijing, but some other countries. And then we extrapolate the monetary value that they found to our setting. And how those authors got their monetary value were basically simply by running a survey, by asking people, hey, how much are you willing to accept if I were to switch you from a private transportation to public transportation? So this is what in the literature we call it a stated preference. So essentially, if there's no creative substitutes, we'll just ask people directly the question, how much are you willing to pay or how much are you willing to accept for this trade-off?
I see. And then for everyone, there's some point where the discomfort becomes too great for them to accept, but that differs from person to person. Is that right?
Okay. Exactly. So by getting average. Yeah.
Yep. Speaking of survey, part of this study included a survey of Beijing residents. What did that involve, and was that challenging in any way? Were people willing to participate, and do you think you got good responses from the residents?
Good question. So interestingly, actually surveys got really easy in recent years. In the past, when we need to conduct survey, we actually need to go down to the location itself, knock on doors and all that stuff. But now with internet, it's so much more convenient. There are a lot of companies who have panels of respondents that's willing to answer surveys for a very small fee. The trade-off is these respondents are often young, highly educated, high income. So they are not very representative of the population that we need. And in this case, because we need not just respondents from Beijing, but we need respondents to be broadly representative of the population in Beijing. So it actually took us some time to be able to draw out the respondents that can fit the overall population distribution of Beijing in a better way. In most internet surveys, we started off with a pretty low incentive. In this case, after some time, we realized that we are not going to get the population that we want then. And after that, we increased the incentive several more times so that we can finally get the people that we really want to survey to make sure that it's overall representative of Beijing. But all in all, I would still say that conducting a survey over the internet is way easier in this case, compared to the past where we had to be there physically.
Let's move on to some of the findings then. What do you feel are the key findings of the study in your opinion?
The first key finding is that most demand-side mitigation measures are detrimental to individuals' welfare. That's surprising to me. I kind of expected it because if it wasn't, I wouldn't be conducting this study to begin with. People would already be changing their behaviors pretty easily. So I had a hunch that would happen. What was surprising to me was that even if we account for the cost of carbon, a lot of behaviors are still detrimental to welfare at a societal level. So that part was surprising. What it means is the emissions mitigation potential of a lot of these behaviors are not that great. And because they are not that great, that means that even if we take a broader view and look at it from a societal perspective, it's still not clear if government should really persist, at least on the broad scale, on demand-side mitigation.
Okay, I read that part in the report, and I wasn't quite sure I understood.
Okay, let me try to break it down. Okay, so the main gist of this paper is to look at the cost benefit or the welfare implications from an individual viewpoint. And in economics, we tend to assume that individuals don't really care about environmental outcomes. And it makes sense from an economics viewpoint because a lot of these environmental outcomes are what we call public goods. And so from the individual level, there's really no reason for us to care about public goods. And this is especially true in the case of climate change, because a lot of these behaviors, what they will result in is a lower level of CO2. So CO2 in itself is not a direct pollutant to people. Second, it's not a local pollutant, it's a global pollutant, or rather a global atmospheric air, or whatever you call it. So in that case, the assumption that individuals do not factor the emissions reduction or mitigation potential into their cost-benefit ledger makes sense. But from a societal viewpoint, governments would care about environmental outcomes because that's what governments are designed to do. That's what public institutions are designed to do. They are designed to take into account of all these public goods and bads. When we refer to societal welfare, it means that we are taking the individual welfare plus the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions has a global price and not a local price. Again, because greenhouse gas is a global pollutant, not a local one.
Okay, I think I understand that. Now, the study also found that 8 out of 12 of the pro-climate behaviors reduced individual welfare. What does that really mean to the individual as far as having a lower welfare from these behaviors?
Right. When we break it down, we see that actually a lot of these behaviors have this characteristic where adopting these low carbon behaviors would increase welfare at a pecuniary level. But it's the non-pecuniary part that's really driving down the overall welfare implications. So that means that we cannot just look to the monetary savings if we want to justify low carbon behaviors or pro-climate behaviors. We have to look into the non-pecuniary parts. The example I used was switching from private to public transport. You will save money, but you also incur a lot of discomfort costs, a lot of time costs that will actually drive up the cost of this behavior.
The study identified some behaviors that could be thought of as like low-hanging fruits for policymakers. Which are those, and what could policymakers do to take advantage of that?
So how we define low-hanging fruits, basically behaviors that has a positive welfare implications at the individual level and that has high emissions mitigation potential. Okay, so these are what we think governments can more easily focus on because they are already beneficial to welfare at the individual level. Then it really shouldn't take that much to convince people to switch their behaviors. So the 3 that we have identified are switching from internal combustion engine to battery electric vehicles, switching from domestic flights to high-speed rail. So this is contextual to Beijing, and switching from meat or animal protein to tofu.
Based on that, what would you recommend to policymakers? What would they do with that information?
We are aware that by simply saying, look, these behaviors are good, focus on them, is not sufficient information for policymakers to act on. So that's why in this study, we also incorporated this thing called a tornado analysis. Basically, it's just a fancy way of saying that since each behavior has different sets of costs and benefits, meaning each behavior has their constituents of costs and benefits, we can undertake more analysis to see which of these costs and benefits are most influential in affecting the welfare of these behaviors. For instance, switching from internal combustion engine to electric vehicle, we found that the price of the vehicles are the most influential in convincing people to switch. So meaning policies that can drive a wedge between these two sets of prices would have a big impact. Interestingly, we found that energy prices actually do not play as much of a role, despite anecdotes about how the pump prices is causing people to switch to electric vehicles and whatnot. But this is not what we found in this study. We found that whether it's the electricity price or gasoline price, it really doesn't affect the overall cost benefit or the overall welfare figures that much. It's really the price of the vehicles. And similarly, by using these tornado analysis, we also looked at some of the other factors that affect the other behaviors as well.
Do you have any insight onto interventions in Beijing by the local authorities that had been tried regarding any of these behaviors?
They have done two things. First is a lot of persuasion, or as we call them, moral suasion in Singapore's context. So basically just preaching to the population. And in fact, this is where we got this list of 12 behaviors, because the different branches of local governments in Beijing actually have advocated for these behaviors in different ways. So we compiled all these behaviors that they had advocated for, and then we chose the top 12 that were most frequently mentioned. So moral suasion is one, basically just telling people about it. Another thing that I think they are doing right now, they're currently embarking on, is giving people a chance to record or to tally up their behaviors in an app, for instance. But this only works for certain behaviors that can be readily collected and verified in an app. For instance, certain brands of electric vehicles are linked to their app, and every time you charge a vehicle, you will be recorded as you are charging an EV. And then you will receive some kind of credit from the Beijing government, which you can then exchange for vouchers or discounts or whatnot. In Singapore's context, it's pretty similar to the health app that we have, where we get points for steps or yes, exactly. So it's similar to that concept.
Yeah, I'm wearing that watch on my wrist right now for the steps. Is there any way that policymakers can address the psychological and time costs associated with pro-climate behaviors?
So time cost, obviously, it really depends on the behavior that we're talking about. Some requires a lot more intervention than the others. Like, for instance, China is peculiar in the sense that they have a very extensive network of high-speed rail. So in that case, to reduce the time taken to do domestic travels within the country is a lot easier in China compared to a place like the United States, where, the local rail infrastructure has not been built up since the 1900s. China has already invested a lot of money, so it's much more easier for them to reduce the time cost of domestic travels. Similarly, for changing from private to public transport, that requires another set of interventions. For instance, investing more in infrastructure, increasing number of buses or trains or frequencies, allowing them more leeway in terms of giving them right of way during congested rush hour. So all this will help for time costs. But again, it really depends on the behaviors that we are talking about. Some are more feasible than others. In terms of psychological, it depends on the nature of it. Again, if you're talking about switching from private to public transport, we have to look more deeply into the context of the place. In certain countries, they reduce psychological cost of traveling by having gender-specific cabins. So that will help some people feel more comfortable taking public transport. And say switching your diet from animal protein to a plant-based protein diet. So that I would say it takes a lot more time because there has to be educational base. That we have to start from a very young age if we want to shape people's preferences in that manner.
Moving on to some of the dietary changes, and you found that animal protein to tofu was the only behavior in your study that enhances social welfare after accounting for emissions mitigation. And the study said primarily because tofu is familiar and widely consumed protein in China. Does this have any special relevance to Singapore, or is the dietary culture here just too different?
A large portion of population is Chinese, and we do consume tofu as part of a regular diet. So I would say that it wouldn't take too much to convince people. Maybe not give up meat totally, but at least substitute a portion of your meat with tofu and still get your dietary requirements met. But I would say we can actually generalize or extrapolate this finding to other culture, because that's something that I'm trying to work on now, which is, you see, a lot of cultures have traditional plant-based protein. For instance, the Malays, they have tempeh, which is a form of tofu but fermented, which is also a good source of protein. The Indians, they have lentils and chickpeas, which is their source of protein, vegetarian protein. And in the Latin America, they eat a lot of beans and rice, which is, again, a source of protein. So my take is rather than reinvent the wheel with the modern plant-based protein that is supposed to mimic meat's texture and behavior, but costs a lot more than regular meat, why not we look more closely into what people have been consuming for the past 1,000 or 2,000 years and try to borrow and try to lean on that. And so this is why in our findings, we saw that we were able to switch tofu to being socially welfare enhancing. And the main reason is because the cost of tofu is way lower than plant-based meat. At the individual level, the detrimental impact on welfare was not that big to begin with because of the price of tofu. And once we include the societal benefits, it's actually not that difficult to switch it over. And I suspect it's the case for other traditional types of plant-based protein. Yeah. So anyway, to answer your question, yes, I do think that there's a lot of relevance to Singapore, not just for the Chinese population, but for the Malays and the Indians as well.
Just in general, what was the most surprising finding for you personally as you were going through this process?
As I mentioned, the most surprising was definitely that even after we included the cost of carbon, that a lot of these behaviors are still detrimental to society. And why I say that is because there are many price of carbon that can be used. For instance, in the US, the US EPA, they now use a price of carbon, I don't know, maybe around 70 or 80 USD per ton. But in our study, we set a very high benchmark. We use a price of 185 USD per ton of carbon. So this is way higher. Again, for context, Singapore's carbon tax is around 25 Singapore dollars per ton, but we're using 185 USD. So initially, I thought that with such a high price for carbon, we would find that if we include the price of carbon in all these behaviors, we should see all of them being positive. At least, even if they are negative from an individual's perspective, they should be positive from a societal perspective. But so the surprising part is, even after using such a high price of carbon, we still find that a lot of these behaviors are detrimental to society. So that means that even if governments want to justify these behaviors from a societal viewpoint, it's not something they should propagate on a very broad level, which means that we should still take a very targeted approach and look at what are the behaviors that's really beneficial at the individual level and that has high emissions mitigation potential to target, rather than focus on all low carbon behaviors under the sun.
Looking forward, are there any other behaviors or areas that you believe should be analyzed in future studies using a similar cost-benefit analysis?
For any cities, countries, or whatnot that wants to advocate this type of demand mitigation behaviors, my recommendation obviously is to use our method, use our framework before you're embarking on this whole propagation campaign. Having said that, I'm also conducting some other studies on trying to better understand the welfare implications of these behaviors across different segments of society. Because what we had done in this paper is to basically look at it from the perspective of an average Beijing resident. But we would think that different segments of the population, say low income, high income, different education level, some of these behaviors may have different welfare implications for different segments of society. So that's another thing we are interested in looking at in the next project, which is to narrow it deeper to look at the welfare implications on different segments of society and see if we can devise even more targeted interventions for different segments of people.
Right. So it's really the targeting the right people that's the key.
Right. The right people and the right behaviors.
Key to getting the best outcomes as far as climate mitigation based on these behaviors.
Right.
So that's really what you're pushing for as far as getting that idea out there to policymakers. Are there anything else that you see as next steps in research for demand side mitigation? Anything on the horizon that you think would be useful for everyone to know?
Yeah, so right now I'm also trying to look more deeply into the distinction between beliefs and behaviors. So the idea is that believing in something may not always lead to a change in behavior. In the literature, we call this the attitude behavior gap. So I'm trying to see if this gap has widened or narrowed along with how our knowledge of climate change has changed over the years. So this is another thing that I'm trying to work on. Essentially, they all revolve around the same idea of trying to better understand people's behavior.
Very good. Thank you so much for spending time with us and helping explain this study to us.
Thank you so much for giving me this platform.
If you'd like to subscribe to the Global is Asian newsletter, look for the link in the description or find us on Facebook at Global is Asian.